Most people know the story about the Titanic and the disaster of hitting an iceberg on a maiden voyage. Even though many other shipwrecks occurred and many other loss of life occurred, the Titanic has held the hearts of so many people. And in total there was an estimated 1,517 people killed in the sinking of the Titanic, 832 passengers and 685 crew members. 68%, in fact, the percentage of people on board, passengers and crew, who were lost in the disaster. But 53.4%, the total percentage who could have survived if everyone had been given the number of lifeboat spaces available. There was 2,223 people on board, including children, but only 706 survived the sinking when it plunged into the icy waters, not to be seen again for a long time. The water was cold when the Titanic sunk, -2 degrees. The temperature of the seawater about 28 Fahrenheit. The life expectancy of anyone that made it into the water was only around 15 minutes. Out of the people that perished on the Titanic, 150 victims are buried in Halifax, Canada. Of the 337 bodies recovered, 119 were buried at sea, 209 were brought back to Halifax, 59 were claimed by family and shipped to their home communities. Divers have never found remains, but have found plenty of shoes like this on the bottom of the seabed. Of the 706 survivors, 2 made it to Australia. One was a crewman, a William Murdoch, who we spoke about in part 1, and the second one, a lady, Evelyn Marsden, and this is her story. So let's listen on. Evelyn Marsden was born on the 15th of October 1883, was the only Australian female survivor in the sinking of RMS Titanic, and was rescued in lifeboat 16. She was the daughter of railway worker Walter Marsden and Annie Bradshaw. Her birthplace of Stockland Creek is about 80 kilometres north of Adelaide in South Australia. As a youth, Evelyn learned to row a boat against the tides and currents of the Murray River while visiting a farm at Murray Bridge, South Australia. Evelyn worked as a probationer nurse at the Royal Adelaide Hospital between 15th of January and 11th of November 1907. It was these skills as a rower that would save her life and others. Evelyn, a nurse, worked as a stewardess on the RMS Titanic, and she had previously worked on board the ship RMS Olympic, signed on to the RMS Titanic on the 6th of April 1912, and gave her address as West Midlands Terrace, the Polygon, Southampton. She was an adventurous 28-year-old and single at the time, but she was in love and engaged to one of the doctors who also worked for the White Star Line, a Dr. William Abel James. He studied as a medical student while living in 2 rooms at 22 Glenroy Street, Roath, Glamorgan, Wales, according to the 1901 census. Dr. William James was employed by the White Star Line makers, and the plan was that he and Evelyn would sail together. But shortly before the Titanic voyage, he was transferred off the ship and she had to sail alone, which was probably a good thing because he wouldn't have survived. Evelyn assisted the first-class passengers as a stewardess on board, and she shared her cabin with a Mary Sloane. There was a mention of a letter that she sent to her sister on the 27th of April 1912 after the disaster. We've mentioned that during the night that they were both taken to a Dr. Simpson's room for a little whiskey and water during the disaster. Evelyn apparently laughed and asked the doctor if he thought we needed the whiskey, and he said we should. Miss Marsden was crying, and he was cross with her. He asked if I was afraid, and Evelyn replied that she was not. He said, "Well spoken, like a true Ulster girl." He had to hurry away to see if there was anyone hurt, but she never saw him again. She then put on a lifebelt and got on deck. But first she went to her rooms to see if all the passengers were up and if they'd had lifebelts on. On the way she bumped into Mr. Andrews. She read in his face all that she wanted to know. Evelyn was placed into lifeboat 16, and this is where her rowing skills came into effect. She rowed away from the ship as far as she could, and then rowed all night with the passengers until the Carpathia saved them. After arriving in New York after the sinking, she reunited with Dr. James, and they quickly married not long after. During World War I, Dr. James served as a medical officer, being deployed to Egypt and later serving in Britain before returning to Australia in 1919. The couple then moved to the South Australian coastal town of Wallaroo and lived and worked there for 15 months before they moved to the Sydney suburb of Bondi, their last address, where William continued to practice as a doctor. They had no children, and Evelyn died on the 30th of August 1938, aged only 54, and was buried at Waverley Cemetery in Sydney. Her husband died a week later on the 7th of September 1938, reportedly after a short illness. His grandnephew said Dr. James arranged to die when he did, as he could not bear to live without his beloved Evelyn. They're buried together, and their grave was unmarked until the 5th of October 2000, when a headstone was finally erected on their gravesite. Just when you think the story's over, got a little bonus story for you. There just so happens, a couple of rows of graves up, there happens to be a young gentleman that served on the rescue ship Carpathia when the Titanic sank. So he would have helped young Evelyn out of lifeboat 16 and offered her a hot drink and a blanket. So Cunard RMS Carpathia was a single funnel, 4-masted ship, originally designed for the immigration service, plying the North Atlantic between Europe and America. Carpathia became famous when she made a late-night dash to rescue up the survivors of the ill-fated Titanic. Carpathia's bridge officers negotiated surrounding ice fields on her late-night journey, while other crew members were instructed to rig up electric lighting on the side of the ship and prepare vacant cabins for survivors. Chefs were awoken to prepare hot meals and beverages while the ship's doctors were briefed. At about 4 a.m. on the 15th of April 1912, Carpathia arrived at the scene and identified the Titanic's lifeboats in the water. Here they collected all of the Titanic survivors. Harold Thornton Fane was the Carpathia's hospital attendant. He was born in Yass, New South Wales on the 17th of June 1888. Unfortunately, I don't have a photo for you to see, but I thought I'd enclose this so you could see where I got the source of information from, and I also include the photo that I took from Find a Grave with the information. We don't have much, but I'll tell you what I know. So Harold was the second son of Philip Thornton Fane, an English-born doctor, and Annie Flora Willis. His mother died when he was young, and his father remarried, affording him several half-siblings. Now, we don't know why or when Fane first went to sea. In April 1912, he was serving as a hospital attendant aboard the eastbound voyage of the Carpathia when that ship rescued the survivors of the Titanic. Fane continued working at sea after the disaster, and by December 1913, he was a steward aboard Afrique. During 1915, he served aboard Subic, and his last recorded service was in September 1916, when he became a hospital attendant aboard the Ceramic. The Yas Courier states that Harold Fane died at his family home at 2 o'clock on the 14th of July 1917 from an unknown illness. He was buried in Waverley Cemetery, Section 15, Row 34. We had a bit of trouble that day finding this grave, and we did get some help from Famous Graves Down Under. He helped us locate this grave. We had the plot number, and this is definitely the grave, and it has Fane and his family members, but we couldn't find his name. But it's also registered in the cemetery that he's buried in that grave. So maybe it's worn away from time, who knows. But that's definitely his grave, and we know he was only 29 when he passed. So he did pass quite young. I found it ironic that he was in the rescue ship when Evelyn was on the Titanic that sunk, so he would have been involved in all the disaster and the drama as well. And it just so happens that they both came to the same cemetery at the end, and only a few rows apart. But now they all overlook the beautiful sea and rest in peace, hopefully.